Been doing a little economical research, and now I'm wondering, how come banks don't get sued just like everybody else? I keep hearing people say that's just how the system works, when it comes to banks at least. But if any other industry, regardless if it's any small business, grocery store, music industry, if any of those businesses did what banks do, they will 100% get sued, fined, or even shut down completely. So the real question is, why don't banks get the same treatment? What makes them so special to the point they can basically extort the government in a sense and be perfectly fine? And the people working in that industry get paid even more rather than getting prosecuted or being dealt with for real. So first off, let's just talk about lending. All right. Banks lend money that they don't even physically have. Like, if you go to a bank and apply for some loan, they don't have that money to give you. And at first I thought, oh, well, somebody deposited, $10,000. Now that bank has $10,000 to loan. No, that's not even the case no more. At this point, especially when in the digital age, bro, they just type numbers on a computer and that money just magically appears. They create credit is what it is, and then charge interest on it, and then treat that interest as profit, inflating their numbers, making their stocks go up. Meanwhile, the borrower takes on the real risks, their job, their home, their future. And if the loan fails, the borrower gets punished. But when the bank fails, they get a government bailout. And that just don't make sense to me. So I was like, well, isn't this, like predatory lending? Because they know that they're fine, but they know that they're putting their borrowers at risk. And that's where it kind of gets weird, because if it's predatory, why isn't it treated like fraud or misrepresentation? Because again, they don't have the money to lend to you. All they're doing is typing in numbers on a computer and calling it credit when it's not backed by anything. It's not real for real. Like he said on Wall Street, it's fugazi. Like, so it's like if a company knowingly sells a product that customers can't reasonably afford, that's a consumer protection violation, right? But banks can package this as risky loans, rate them as safe, and then sell them off like everything's fine. That's what happened in like 2008 between the banks, AIG, credit raters, and things like this. They'll take all the risky loans, knowing that they're subprime, package them up together, rate them as triple A, which is basically the least risky loans, and then sell them off to what's it called, investors, like everything's fine or whatnot. And then it blew up, and the middle class and lower class absorbed all the damage. So when people talking about a recession and things like that, or even they, like in 2008, that's why it was almost another depression, just because the infrastructure that the banks set up began to fail because numerous reasons. But anyway, I kind of had a fairly long discussion with ChatGPT about this because I wanted to get an understanding. I can't just go talk to a banker right now and get that information. So I really had to kind of dig into a few YouTube videos, ChatGPT a little bit, and things like that. And so let me show y'all what I got. Let me show y'all what I got to, right? Where we at? Where we at? Wait, I gotta go to the top. To the tippy top. Hit the ticky tock. Show me to the ticky drop. All right. Where we at? Where we at? Where we at? All right. So it started off as. Can I zoom in on this? Y'all see it. It started off as, why banks can lend money they don't have. It gave me a little boom, boom, boom about that. You deposit the money isn't in a vault. Its fraction is reserves, and the rest can be lent out, creating new credit. But like I said, the banks don't even have the money in the bank because it's digital. It's not a paper currency. It's not backed by gold or anything anymore. So it's literally just made up numbers. Authorized by federal law, regulated by bank agencies who apparently don't know how to regulate for real because they're scared. We'll get to that in a minute. So when it comes to all of that, my question was, how is this not fraud or misrepresentation when they're practicing predatory lending? That seems like a violation of consumer protection laws, adding interest on money they created, not even real money, and it's not illegal. They have this pseudo that falsely inflates the economy, allowing people to take loans, rating them as AAA, I can't think of the word, but marking them as AAA, putting them in that top tier category, saying that these are non-risky loans, and then selling them off to insurance companies and things like that. And I'm like, that's fraud, right? Because they're clearly lying. What I'm describing can be fraud, but only when specific legal thresholds are crossed. And I'm just like, so now we have to be specific. How is predatory lending not fraud or misrepresentation? It becomes illegal when terms are deceptive or hidden. Borrowers are misled, interest rates resets, ability to refinance the true cost of the loan. So it sounds like that's exactly what happened. So why isn't it considered fraud? And apparently banks have been sued and fined for this. But fraud requires intent, deception, reliance, and damages. So in my head, I'm like, the intent was there. They were definitely being deceptive on purpose. Relying on the fact that you as a regular citizen don't know, as well as it led to extensive damages, not only to our community, but not only to our economy, but also to the communities within the nation. And banks like to say terms are disclosed. That's why you got to read fine print on stuff. Borrowers signed voluntarily, even though they didn't know all the information. Risk was known, not necessarily. And this was bad underwriting, not deception. But you knew that the verbiage used wouldn't be understood by your typical person, by your borrower. You knew they didn't have that information. So if you knew they didn't have the information, how is that not deception? In my head, at least. Charging energy money that they created, blah, 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 blah. AAA ratings, toxic loans, selling them insurers, blah, blah, blah. It's fraud. It says yes. Yes, it is fraud. Why this was fraud legally? Internal documents showed knowledge of misrepresentation. Risk models were manipulated. Ratings agencies were conflicted. Investors relied on false assurances. Led to massive settlements, fine in the tens of billions, new regulations. But nobody went to jail. Nobody. People that ran this Ponzi scheme at the bank decided to, or ended up being, the head of the national treasurer, running the government's treasury, not just the bank treasury. Presidents have appointed these people to run the government's money, essentially. So this is where I really started asking questions. So it's like, but the data is false when companies and banks gains are based on credit, not actual value. And then I wondered if Drake and Young Thug can get hit with a RICO. Why doesn't the same thing happen to big banks, insurance companies, auditors, all these people, right? And economically, it's called distorted. Legally, it's not defined as false. Credit legally is defined as real value, even if it's pulled out of thin air. How is that real value? No idea. Why it is fraud in English, but not legally. That's the crazy part to me. Artificial value creation, asymmetric risk, misleading representation, and someone else is holding the bad, aka your typical citizens, your workforce. Lower and middle class are the ones that gotta bite the bullet when it comes to the bank's mistakes. But fraud requires provable deception, not structural distortion. So the courts end up saying everyone knows banks create credit. Do they? At least your definition of credit. Everyone knows leverage inflates returns. So if it inflates returns, why are those considered actual returns and actual, what's the word? And actual real gains? If you know that leverage inflates the returns. And they say sophisticated parties assume the risk. That doesn't make sense to me. ChatGPT said it right there. Duh. Of course it is. Because who is sophisticated parties? The banks don't, because they get bailed out by the government. You do. I do. The workforce does. Jobs shut down. People can't earn a check for real. Taxes go through the roof. So who's really assuming the risk? And this is where it gets kind of funny. Because RICO applies to rappers, but not banks. So RICO applies to individuals, not institutions, is basically what this is saying. And you'll see it again later on in just a second. RICO case, enterprise, pattern of criminal acts, predicated crimes, intent, direct victims, and illegality of the acts themselves. The reason banks don't get hit with it is because it's chartered by the state. They operate under explicit statutory permission, which means the government allows this because they don't have enough. There's not enough rules to say what you can't do. And if you're not telling somebody what they can't do, that means they can do whatever they want to. This is where regulations come in. This is where voting comes in. This is where paying attention to politics comes in. They create credit legally. They package and sell risk legally. I put that one in air quotes. You'll see why in just a second. And then it says lobby to make sure it stays legal. That's a fancy way of saying a bribe. So they bribe politicians to push the agendas that the banks want to happen. And not even the banks, the people that run the banks. Like, banks aren't just automated. Banks aren't ran by AI and AI is making this happen. No, banks are ran by human beings. And the human beings that are in those positions are the ones that want these things to happen so that they can benefit from it. Not the bank. themselves. They just so happen to collect a check through the bank, which is how they get paid, really, really. So you can't use RICO when an alleged scheme is authorized by law, even if it's abusive. Hold that thought. That's when we come down here. And I said, how do sophisticated parties assume the risk? They get bailed out. The middle and low class get stuck with the consequences. And then talking about that RICO, talking about, because what did it say? What did it say? Apparently, banks don't get RICO because the core acts are legal. All of this we just read, right? Authorized by law, right? So when we come down here and we're talking about Drake infiltrating stream numbers, regardless if it's music, regardless if it's his actual stream on Kick or whatever platform he on, those are legal. Gambling, legal. Sponsored deals, legal. Collaborations, legal. So how does Drake get hit with a RICO charge when everything that he did is technically legal? I'm not abiding by Drake. I'm not saying he did absolutely. I'm not saying it's not morally wrong. It's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to understand, how does he and his circle get hit with a RICO charge, but banks in their circle don't get hit with a RICO charge, and they're doing basically the same thing. Didn't get that. So let's start off with the bailout part. How do sophisticated parties assume risk if they get bailed out? Short answer, they don't. At least not in the way it's phrased. The law claims, and the court says, big banks, insurers, funds, sophisticated. They understand risk, they can price risk, therefore they don't need protection. But what actually happens is losses are socialized, which means the losses come down to us, while gains are privatized, which means the gains go to the people at the top, which basically means if the banks lose, we get hit. We suffer. We get the short end of the stick. But when the bank wins, we still get the short end of the stick, because we don't see those profits. The people at the top do. They the ones that get millions and billions of dollars. So there is no risk to the people at the top, because the risk always trickles down to the bottom. And then on top of that, the banks get bailed out. It protects the counterparties, the executives, the balance sheets, and the public absorbs all of the bad stuff. Wages get stagnant, housing crashes, makes it hard to pay mortgage, makes it hard to buy a house, and inflation goes through the roof. So no, they don't assume the risk. The public does. So that's why I ain't understand about that. Now to the Drake comparison. All of these things are legal, but Drake gets hit with a RICO charge. The real difference between them, as I scroll down, is because financial harm is framed as systemic, not criminal. And that's the big difference. RICO is used to control unauthorized power. So Drake, you're unauthorized to use that power, but which is why you get hit with the charge. But banks have authorized exploitation. The difference is the fact the government sees you as unauthorized, and you should not have the ability to do what these people are doing. That makes no sense to me. But that's why people that aren't in the banks, that aren't in that position of power, don't get hit with that kind of stuff. So essentially, you have to be too big to fail in order to have authorized exploitation. And then when it gets to being too big to fail, I was wondering, so being too big to fail is a kind of a way to say you're extorting the government? Like if we fail, you're coming down with us kind of deal? So you have to bail us out? Short answer, yes, but legally, it's not framed as extortion. Extortion is, if you don't give me money, I'll cause massive harm, which basically they will. But they don't say it that way. And the way you say it apparently makes a big difference. So in banking, they become interconnected. Failure threatens payments, pensions, jobs, housing. The government is forced to intervene because you don't want the economy to collapse. I had to think about it for a second. So the government has to jump in and bail out these banks because the banks collapse, the economy collapse, unfortunately. But the thing is, we wouldn't be in this position if banks didn't inflate their own numbers. Out here lending trillions upon trillions of dollars, knowing that that money doesn't even exist. Knowing that that trillions of dollars is a fake number. That is money that was created, not printed. Just numbers on a spreadsheet that was added as credit. Credited dollars. It's like going to Chuck E. Cheese and they loaned you 10,000 tokens and now you owe $10,000. Ridiculous. But the law doesn't call it extortion. Even though extortion requires a threat, intentional cohesion, unlawful leverage. Now, if you ask me, banks did all of that. But banks say, we didn't threaten. The system failed. We didn't intend collapse. And this was market risk, not coercion. And then the government says that the bailouts, aka being extorted, is talked about as emergency stabilization, not payment under duress. So legally, systemic dependence isn't criminal coercion. Coercion, however you say that word. Help me out, chat. It's been a long day, and I've been looking at screens all day. My mind is kind of melted, wrapping my head around all this stuff. And so I'm like, why do we have to pay? Why the people at the top can't give they billions of dollars? Help the economy get back on track. And in theory, yes, they can be prosecuted. All these people right here are not immune. They could be charged for these things. But they have 4 shields. Diffuse responsibility, which means too many hands on the cookie jar to really figure out who did what. And then everybody's covering each other's backs. So nobody is pointing the finger at anybody. Or everybody's pointing the finger at everybody. I don't know which one it is. Maybe it's a combination of both. But the thing is, they don't know who to get. And if it was just me, I'd just go straight for the top. You the leader, and you the co-leaders. All y'all, who benefited the most? That's who I'm going for. Who got the most money out of what just happened? That's who I'm going for. Because what was it? That one crypto dude, I can't remember his name right now. It escapes me. But that one crypto dude, why he get caught up? Why he had to give his money back? And so, but because everybody pointing at everybody, the intent is hard to prove. So you don't know who did what, and you don't know who knew what because of all the separate parties. We believed in the ratings, we relied on risk models, we followed legal advice. The market turned unexpectedly. Everybody knows a bubble is gonna pop. All they was trying to do is cash out as much as they could with the time that they had. Regulatory rapture. And the same people rotate between, like I said, the banks, they go to regulators, they go to the treasury, and they go to consulting firms. Now, these are people at the top. This dude was at the bank. He got his check. So now he done rotated and got appointed as U.S. Treasury. Why did that happen? Now, that dude, once the president leaves, somebody else comes in, but that dude ends up going to the consulting firms to then bring up those AAA ratings and then sell those to regulators and insurance people and investors. So clearly, all of this isn't enforced, or a lackluster enforcement, soft enforcement, whatever you want to call it. You get negotiated settlements, even though it's not a whole bunch of money. Especially when they got 3-4 different mansions all over the world, in just about every country that they ain't doing nothing with. So no raise, no indictments. And then this is the big one right here. Systemic fear. Indicting top executives could collapse confidence, trigger bank runs, would mean everybody want to pull their money out the bank because they don't trust the bank no more. And because it could trigger bank runs, it can lead to destabilized markets, which means, and because all currencies are backed by the US dollar, if the US dollar destabilizes and collapses, if the US market collapses, the entire world market collapses, which is potentially why we got people like Russia, we got people like China, we got people in other areas that don't believe in the US, because y'all are building a system made out of Jenga blocks. The foundation is made out of Jenga blocks, not just a solid foundation and then you putting Jenga blocks on top of the foundation. No. The foundation itself is built out of Jenga blocks. So anything built on top of that, as soon as that foundation collapses, everything on top collapses. And it's not justice, it's damage control. Ooh, excuse me. So a system has been put in place to allow this to happen, to continue to allow it to happen. And so it's not capitalism. It's not free market. It's privatized gains and socialized losses. And the most dangerous part about it all is it's normalized. We're so used to this system, so used to being in this clockwork, running through this rat race, and constantly being distracted between TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all this short-term stuff that we never look at the long-term detriments. To the fact that we never realize what we could actually go and vote for. Because the only vote majority of people know about is your presidential election. You don't realize you're voting for the person that's over the schools, person that's over housing committee within your city, treasurers within your city, person that delegates where the taxes and things are going. So if you want the roads to be fixed, you got to vote for the person that's going to fix them. So just going to that ballot and circling Republican or Democrat for everything, not knowing that there's like 4 or 5 parties you can vote for. You're doing yourself a disservice. Sorry. But this is what I want to know. What does it take to make a change? What does it take to do something different? If regular people can be sued, fined, imprisoned for financial misconduct, why do banks get immunity? Why do we keep letting this happen? And if the answer is because the system would collapse if we didn't, then maybe the real problem is the system, not the banks. The government, the laws are there to check greed, to check deception. But it's not checking it. It's allowing it to continue to happen because the system itself would fail. Maybe we need a hard reset. Maybe we just need to start over. Maybe the dollar needs to be backed by something, regardless if that's fresh water, something valuable, regardless if that's fresh water, regardless if it's gold, diamonds. I wouldn't even say diamonds because diamonds itself is inflated. Renewable energy, kilowatt hours. I just think the dollar needs to be backed by something, not just made up by numbers. And fed to us like sugar. It's like drinking a Coke without really eating food. Sure, you feel full. Sure, you feel satisfied. But between the sugar that's in that Coke, the corn syrup that's in that Coke, and every other product that's literally hurting you from the inside out, and then you get no real nutrients. You get no real sustenance. But that's it for this one. I just wanted to share that with you because I went for a nice little deep dive. And I thought y'all would want to dive with me. So I think as a people, we need to come together. We got to figure this thing out. Because if we don't, we're going to struggle more and struggle harder. But let me know what you think in the comments. Go ahead and give me a like. Subscribe for more content. From the east to the west. Peace.